This lesson will be predominantly about using a relative reference point in advanced ways to further increase your drawing capabilities. But first of all, I want to talk about these tabbed layer lists here on the right hand side. If you notice over here on the very right hand side of the screen, the command line is highlighted here. If I click it, it removes it from the viewable area of the Qcad window, and it's no longer highlighted. Same with the property editor. If I click this highlighted icon, then the property editor is removed. And if I click the final one, the layer list icon, then the layer list is removed, and now you have a much larger drawing space. So if you're doing a large drawing, you need large drawing space, then you can disable these viewed lists, which in our case is tabbed. You just turn them so they're not viewable anymore, and then you regain your drawing space. So we're going to do that during this lesson because we don't need those 3 tabs to perform this lesson. So while we're on this subject, what happens if I click on these icons, such as the icon for the clipboard, so I can view the contents of the clipboard? What happens if I click that when I have these other 3 items already tabbed? Well, if I enable the view of it, it simply puts it in the list viewing area by itself. If I now enable the things that were tabbed, one of them doesn't need to be tabbed. If I enable the second one, enable viewing, notice they become tabbed now. So they're honoring a tab situation. However, the clipboard isn't because it was never tabbed. So I just wanted you to understand it might get a little confusing. If you just turn on one of these, you're expecting a tab, but it's not a tab. It's just stacked up on top of the other one. So I wanted to point that out so that you aren't surprised when you start enabling these tabbed items. When there's something enabled, the viewing is enabled on something that wasn't tabbed. Here we have a complex problem described down here in the bottom left-hand corner of the drawing area. And it describes a situation where we want a circle whose center is going to be at the cross point of this end of this line and the end of this line. So the center is somewhere around there. And the radius of the circle will be from that center point up to 13, 16 units from the center of this ellipse. So we've got to come out here 13 x's, 16 y's from the center of that ellipse. And that'd be the radius of the circle, which is centered right here. So in order to solve this problem, we have to break it into some different pieces here. The relative reference point will become very handy. And in the first situation, what we want to do is define the radius point of the circle. I'm going to use the end of a line as the reference point to limit the radius of the circle. And I use some other tricks to get the center of the circle. So let's do the radius of the circle reference point first. So to get started, we go ahead and we select we're going to draw a line with 2 endpoints. And we're going to snap to the center of something, not this. We'll snap to the center of this guy right here. And now that's our relative reference point. The next part of the line, we're going to use the command line. It's already asking for the next reference point, so that's going to be simply 13, 16 as described right here, 13, 16 units. So we'll say 13, 16 units. Is that correct? No, it's not. The reason it's not correct, we're not using a relative reference point. That would be absolute references, which would be a reference to this crosshair down here. So let's put an @ sign in front of this. Now these dimensions are from this relative reference point right here, 13, 16. So we can hit enter now. We've defined that line. So I'm going to make the drawing a little bit smaller by zooming out. So now right there is going to be the point that's going to define the radius of that circle. The next project is to find the center of the circle. Next, we want to use the relative reference point to do 3 things. We want to start the center of a circle at this relative reference point. we want to define two spokes from that relative reference point. So what we want to do is find that relative reference point wherever it is and then lock it so it doesn't move as we add the circle when we add the two spokes. So let's get that process started. Right now, as you can see, the relative reference point is at the end of this line we just drew. So we're going to go up here and use the snap menu. We're going to set the relative reference point. We're going to restrict it vertically. We're going to use this line in. We're using auto, so it says it's snapping to the end of the line. That sets the relative reference point along this horizontal line. Notice it couldn't go vertically. It had to stay horizontal. So I'll use the next endpoint and snap it, restricting it vertically. So we'll go back to snap again, set the relative reference point. We're going to select the end of this line. First I got to set horizontal limitations. And now let's snap to the end of that other line and notice where the relative reference point is going to be down here. So it was orthogonally restricted to this point here, and now it's being vertically restricted to this point here. Therefore, that is now the relative reference point where these two line ends cross. So we've established a relative reference point. Now what we have to do is lock it so it doesn't move on us, because the next thing we draw will move it. So we're going to lock the relative reference point. And now if you notice, if I select a tool, such as drawing a line between 2 points, notice the relative reference point didn't move. It's still right here. It stays right there. I'll delete this line. Delete key. So now we're going to use a circle command to draw a circle. Come down here and pick this up. We'll do a center point and a radius. That's two things we have. Notice it's asking for the center point right here. So I'll say relative 0, 0. So the circle starts, the center point starts right there. I hit enter. Now it wants to know the radius. I can change the radius to the end point and set it to the end point of that line right there. And now we've completed our circle. It's asking for the next circle center. We'll just right click, get out of that. So let me make this a little bit smaller. So now we have a circle. The center of the circle is at the intersection of the two endpoints of these two lines. The radius of the circle is this distance over here, 13, 16 units from the center of that ellipse. That's the radius of the circle. So the circle has been fully defined. Now we need to add the spokes. If you remember, this line was added to offset 13, 6 from the center of that ellipse and find the radius of the circle. We've now established the radius of the circle. We've established the center of the circle. We no longer need this temporary line. So I'm going to select it, hit the delete key, and delete it. So now we're ready to do the spokes on the circle. So the next phase of this problem is how do we get the spokes in place? Well, we know that we could use an angle and a length to get the spoke in here, but we're not sure about the length. We know the length is 10, 20, about 28 units, 27 units. So let's just approximate initially, and then we use a line extension to make it exact. So the first phase of the first line is that we want to do a double-ended line. The first point, we'll come down here and click in here and put at, because we want it to be 0, 0 for the beginning, which is at the relative reference point. So we hit enter. Now it's got wants the next point of the line. Well, here we're going to use relative reference point at an angle. So we're going to put at. We'll make it 10 units. 10 units at an angle of 13 degrees. Hit enter on that. Now we've got this line right here. You can see this line. That's 13 degrees, 10 units. So let's go ahead and draw the other line angle, and then we'll go extend both lines. So the second line has to be an angle of 273 degrees. Notice we're waiting for the first point again, so the first point will once again be the relative reference point at 0, 0. Enter. And then the second point of our line will be 10 units relative, 10 units at an angle of 273 degrees. And now that line's been defined. And I'll right click to get out of that. So we got the two spokes now defined. What we have to do is bring the spokes all the way to the circumference of the circle. That's quite easy to do if we go back here and use our modify programs. Right here we have a tool called trim tool. Notice when I select the tool, it says choose a limiting entity. The limiting entity is going to be the circle. Choose entity to trim, which would be this line. Notice I go to the line and it takes it right to there. Once again, choose entity to trim. This is why I did them both before I trimmed them. Now both lines are trimmed exactly to circumference of that circle. So we now have achieved our goal. We've met the conditions defined here. It took a few steps, but it's very precise, it's very accurate, and that's what this Qcad program is all about, accuracy. As I've said before, anytime you use an unusual feature such as your lock the relative reference key here, always make sure you disable it as soon as you're finished using it. Same with these orthogonal restrictions. Always disable them with the plus. Make sure the key's not highlighted. That way you won't get any surprises later when you're trying to do something you've long forgotten that you locked something or set an orthogonal restriction on something. So this concludes lesson 19. Lesson 19 was primarily relative reference point, but had a few other extras added at the beginning.